Amid blooming roses lies a chilling secret, waiting to be uncovered. Welcome to Mystery Tales. I am your host, Gravemind. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Now let's unravel the mystery. The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on its tranquil order. Gardens were tended with precision, hedges trimmed just so, and gossip flowed as naturally as the tea poured into porcelain cups. It was early June when the annual Rose Show was held in the vicarage garden, a much-anticipated event where rivalries bloomed as fiercely as the flowers themselves. The villagers came in their Sunday best, hats adorned with ribbons, parasols shading delicate complexions, and an air of expectancy clinging to every polite smile. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the trellised arch of white climbing roses, had her knitting needles in hand. She was not officially a competitor, though she had been known to coax remarkable blossoms from her modest garden. Instead, she came to observe, for such gatherings provided fertile ground for studying human behavior. One learned a great deal, she always said, from the way a woman boasted of her roses or of her neighbors' failures. The centerpiece of the afternoon was, of course, the awarding of the Silver Rose Cup, a gleaming trophy that had passed between generations of gardeners. This year, the fiercest competition was expected between Mrs. Amelia Harcourt, a widow of formidable presence with roses of extraordinary vibrancy, and Colonel Archibald Blount, a retired officer, with a fondness for regimented flower beds and strict order in all things. Their rivalry had been the subject of much whispered amusement, for both seemed determined not only to win, but to triumph over the other. When the vicar's wife stepped up to announce the winner, a hush fell over the crowd. "And this year's Silver Rose Cup," she declared with a smile, "goes to Mrs. Amelia Harcourt for her exquisite Queen of the Night hybrid." There was a polite round of applause, though Miss Marple noticed the tightness around Colonel Blount's mouth and the way his hands clenched behind his back. Mrs. Harcourt accepted her prize with gracious words, though her eyes glittered with satisfaction as she held the trophy aloft. The gathering continued with tea, scones, and more conversation, but an air of tension lingered like the faint hum of bees among the roses. It was just as the sun dipped low and the villagers began to disperse that the first sign of something amiss arose. Mrs. Harcourt was not to be found. She had stepped away with her prize to show it to a neighbor and had not returned. At first it was assumed she had gone home early. But when the vicar's maid went to collect the empty teacups from the side garden, a sharp cry pierced the evening air. Within moments, the villagers crowded toward the rose walk, where the maid stood trembling, her hand pointing toward a cluster of crimson blooms. There, among the heavy, sweet-scented blossoms, lay Mrs. Amelia Harcourt, the Silver Rose Cup toppled beside her, its polished surface smeared with earth. Her face was unnaturally pale, her body quite still, and on her wrist, faint bruising suggested she had not fallen by accident. A murmur of shock rippled through the gathering, voices rising with fear, disbelief, and suspicion. Colonel Blount pushed forward, his face ashen, while others exchanged quick, nervous glances. The roses, so carefully nurtured, seemed suddenly sinister, their beauty masking the violence that had just taken place. Miss Marple, her knitting laid gently aside, rose from her chair. She moved closer with unhurried steps, her expression mild and curious, though her eyes, bright and sharp as ever, took in every detail. She did not speak, nor did she show surprise, for Miss Marple had long understood that in the most picturesque of villages, human passions could bloom just as fiercely as any rose, and could prove every bit as deadly. The first to recover her voice was Mrs. Hemmings, the vicar's wife, whose composure had been strained all afternoon by the rivalry over the cup, and now snapped with a flurry of apologies and instructions. She fluttered her hands, as though the air itself might be tidied if waved at briskly enough. "Please, everyone, back a little, give her space. Jonathan, fetch Dr. Parry. No, he's at his sister's in Much Benham. Then the constable, at once." The maid, Ivy, clung to the trellis, white-faced and hiccuping tears, while the assembled villagers shifted by inches rather than feet, unwilling to miss anything their eyes could later translate into opinion. Miss Marple stood a pace or two removed, as if respectful of death's privacy. She noticed how the silver rose cup had landed mouth down, half sunk into the loose soil, piled at the base of the crimson roses. That was odd. A person who dropped a prized object in alarm would more often release it scattersome on the grass. Soil on the rim suggested a deliberate press or an awkward struggle. Then there was the bruise at Mrs. Harcourt's wrist, thumb-shaped, darkening. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Ivy, whose hands trembled with the jerky rhythm of genuine surprise rather than staged distress, and then to Colonel Blount, who stared at the body with a stiff, affronted posture, as if the corpse had committed a breach of etiquette by lying among the roses. The first whispers unfurled behind the hedge like a pennant catching wind. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had not won a ribbon in 3 years, and possessed a tongue which made up for the deficiency, leaned to Mrs. Bartlett. "I always said Amelia was asking for trouble with those hybrids. They're unnatural, you know. And she was reckless with the arsenic. It is used in the soil, isn't it? For pests. Well, she made a pursed sound that meant, I am too discreet to speculate, and also, I am speculating furiously." Mrs. Bartlett looked gratified to be consulted. "They say she sent for cuttings from Holland, quite dear, and wouldn't tell a soul what she did to make them bloom like that. Secrecy in a gardener never bodes well. And you saw the Colonel when the prize was announced, didn't you?" Fair thunderclouds. Colonel Blount overheard enough to rotate his head with slow martial control. "Madame," he said, "I was disappointed. That is not a crime." His voice had the resonance of parade ground commands thinned out by age. "No." "Indeed," Mrs. Bartlett murmured, in the tone of one who confirms everything while conceding nothing. Young Timothy Seaton, the new chemist's assistant, was more eager than tactful. He hovered near the fallen cup, his pale eyes moving with clinical curiosity. "It could be a seizure," he offered into the air, not addressing anyone in particular. "My aunt had them. Dropped without warning. 1 minute she's shelling peas, the next, plop." "Your aunt," Mrs. Price Ridley said, "did she always bruise her wrist before she fell? I suppose she might have caught it on something, but really—" She cast a look toward Miss Marple, as one appeals to a tribunal. "Miss Marple, you have a sensible mind. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's smile was apologetic, almost helpless. "Oh, my dear, I don't make very much of anything at first. One mustn't hurry about death, I always think. People who rush to conclusions often trip over the simplest things. I do wonder, though, do you recall if Mrs. Harcourt wore her garden gloves after the announcement? One sees such little habits. Some ladies will put gloves on to hold a trophy, you know. It makes the fingers look elegant in photographs." Mrs. Hemmings blinked. "Photographs? Oh dear, I had meant to have one taken by Mr. Cotterill for the parish newsletter." But then Amelia, Mrs. Harcourt, slipped away. She said Mrs. Fanshawe wanted to see the cup up close. She turned about. "Where is Mrs. Fanshawe?" A very slender woman with large eyes and an over-deliberate gentleness stepped forward. "I'm here. I did ask to see it. I admired the etching round the base last year, and thought I had never noticed how charming it was. But before I could, Amelia was called by somebody, I think it was Mr. Cotterill, and then I lost sight of her." Her voice trembled with sincerity. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, a shade too perfectly. Mr. Cotterill, a small man with wiry hair and the artistic gloom of a photographer whose subjects were not ideal, protested. "I called to her from the far side of the green, yes, to stand by the arch for a picture, but she did not come. I was occupied with capturing the Colonel's particular displeasure, our dignity, when the maid cried out." He swallowed. "Poor woman." Constable Weaver, broad and earnest, arrived at a trot, hat a-tilt, notepaper flapping from his pocket like a surrendering flag. He cleared a respectful perimeter, flustered his way into what he called an initial survey, and then addressed the group with an authority borrowed from police dramas on the wireless. If you'll all be so good as to remain nearby, I'll be needing statements. No touching, nothing. He shot an accusing glance at Timothy Seaton, whose hands flew obediently behind his back. Dr. Parry's arrival restored a kind of order. He knelt, performed the rituals of examination, frowned and stood with a crease between his brows. "She is gone," he said simply. "It appears sudden. The bruising here," he indicated the wrist, "might be from a grasp or a fall. I cannot say more without, well," he coughed. "In any case, Constable, you had better inform Melchester. We must be proper." A breath of relief and disappointment rippled through the crowd. Proper meant official. Official meant serious, and serious meant the day's entertainment now had rules. As the constable plodded toward the vicarage telephone, the ring of villagers took one small collective step inward, to the edge of propriety. Stories sprouted like dandelions. Mrs. Price Ridley recalled now with unwavering certainty that Mrs. Harcourt had quarrelled last month with Mr. Jessup. The nurseryman about a late delivery of Pete. Mr. Jessup, who had the honest, harried expression of a man perpetually behind on orders, swore they had merely discussed logistics. Mrs. Fanshawe confided shyly that Amelia had once hinted at a very trying cousin who importuned her for money. She could not quite remember the cousin's name, only that he was sallow. Mr. Cotterell insisted he had heard a metallic clink behind the rose arch after the announcement, which might have been the cup or might have been a trowel, or he admitted his imagination. Colonel Blount, in tones of solemn rectitude, reflected that a certain type of woman grew overconfident with admiration, and that such confidence bred carelessness. "Not that I mean to impugn the dead," he added, catching the look on Mrs. Hemmings's face, "but pride precedes many a mishap." Miss Marple let the talk wash over her, picking out the useful pebbles hidden in the froth. There are, she always thought, very few original crimes. People do what they have always done. Envy, fear, love, save face, conceal past foolishness. Of all the remarks, she tucked away two without apparent interest. The first was Mrs. Hemmings's mention of gloves. The second was Mrs. Fanshawe's over-particular reference to the etching round the base of the cup. She had admired it last year, had she? Many people admired trophies, but few noticed their etchings unless there was a reason. Memory or money, usually. Ivy had steadied. Miss Marple approached her with the soft tread of unaimed comfort. "It is a dreadful shock, child. Sit a moment. I expect you tripped into the garden because you keep things very neat, and were anxious about the cups." Ivy nodded, hiccuping. "Mrs. Hemmings likes them all taken in together." There were two missing. Mrs. Harcourt had one, and the Colonel had not finished his. "I looked for his first, as he's particular about the milk, but then I saw—" Her voice thinned away. "Two missing," Miss Marple repeated mildly. "Did Mrs. Harcourt add milk herself?" "No, miss. She takes hers with lemon. We had only a few slices, and I kept them in the small blue saucer by the sugar, else people take two. There was one left when she went, I'm sure." Ivy blinked, frowning. "But then there were none." "Ah," said Miss Marple, with the sort of agreeable syllable one uses on a fine day. "Blue saucer. I always think lemons show very prettily on blue." Colonel Blount had wandered near enough to catch the last words. "Lemon," he repeated. "Sensible. Milk ruins tea." He looked at Miss Marple with distant courtesy, and then oddly at the collapsed roses, their crimson heads heavy as if bowed in mourning. "Harcourt overwatered," he muttered. "Any fool can make a spectacle with excess. Discipline is art." "It is certainly one kind," Miss Marple agreed, as if musing about dahlias. In her mind, the small blue saucer took its place beside the pressed rim of the cup and the obedient tremor of Ivy's hands. She thought, too, of a woman who noticed etchings and a colonel who spoke of discipline as beauty. Human beings, she reflected, reveal themselves most plainly when they believe they are speaking about something else. By the time Inspector Cray arrived from Melchester, the shadows were long, and the roses exhaled their last heavy sweetness. He was a neat man with careful shoes and a guarded face, and he listened with punctilious patience to Constable Weaver's summary. then to Dr. Parry's considerations. He took statements, nodded, and set 2 officers to keep the scene undisturbed. He asked Miss Marple courteously if she had seen anything. She smiled and said she had only seen people being themselves, which often tells us more than actions. In my experience, Inspector Cray said, surprising her with the remark. Indeed, said Miss Marple, with the polite tone of an old lady approving a clever grandson's Latin. And yet, it is usually the little actions one forgets which matter most. A saucer moved, a glove put on, or not, glove? Cray lifted his head. Oh, merely a thought about photographs, she said, and let it drift away like a thread of wool in the breeze. As the last of the villagers were shepherded to the vicarage for tea that no one would drink, Miss Marple settled again on her chair and took up her knitting. She did not knit, however. Her needles were contrite, motionless things. She was thinking of lemons in a blue saucer, and of how people who are angry handle delicate objects, roughly as the soil on the cup suggested, or, if they are frightened, not at all. She was thinking of Mrs. Harcourt's wrist, and who in St. Mary Mead possessed the habit of taking hold rather than persuading. And she was thinking gently that the roses were only roses. The thorns would be found elsewhere. Inspector Cray's preliminary questions carried on until twilight, the murmur of voices fading only when the villagers returned to their respective homes. Doors closed more firmly than usual that evening, curtains twitched before being drawn, and lamps lit in quick succession across St. Mary Mead, as if each household were warding off the unease that had crept into their tranquil village. Death, after all, was not new to life, but murder, or the suggestion of it, had a way of turning every glance into suspicion and every memory into whispered testimony. At the vicarage, Miss Marple lingered a little longer than most, knitting bag looped neatly over her arm. She had given the inspector only the mildest of impressions, that she had noticed little more than the mood of the crowd and a remark about gloves. Yet her eyes, though tired in their corners, had traced the lines of unease in every face. She knew well enough that gossip, though unkind at times, often yielded small truths that the formal sternness of police interrogation could not uncover. People, when they thought themselves safe among neighbours, revealed more in a careless phrase than in any carefully drafted statement. By the following morning, the death of Mrs. Amelia Harcourt was not simply a fact. It was a story embroidered in a dozen variations. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared in ringing tones that Amelia had been as good as killed months ago by her own arrogance. Those roses of hers were never natural. I said it, and I'll say it again, unnatural. Mrs. Price Ridley, delivering letters from her nephew the curate, added that she had heard Amelia was in dreadful financial straits and might have taken something herself rather than face exposure. Debts, dear. You know how they mount. A person does foolish things. At the Green Man Inn, Mr. Finch the publican suggested over pints that Colonel Blount's temper had not cooled since the competition. Did you see his face when she raised that cup? Fit to burst he was. Military man, they say. But a man's pride is his undoing more than once. The blacksmith's boy leaned across the counter, eager to contribute. And didn't I see him follow her? Round the back toward the roses. That I did. His father cuffed him sharply for speaking nonsense, but the words clung in the air all the same. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fanshawe wept delicately to anyone who would listen, insisting she had been the last to see Amelia alive, and that her kindness had been to admire the trophy, not to begrudge it. She was my dearest friend in the village, you know. I cannot think who would wish her harm. Such a sweet soul, though of course she could be rather sharp when crossed. Her protestations of affection struck some as overdone, others as touching, but all noted them carefully for later retelling. Miss Marple moved gently among these conversations, never pressing, never contradicting, merely listening as one who found the world's tales diverting. People thought it natural for her to take interest. What else did a solitary old lady do but knit and take note of village goings-on? Her questions, when they came, were so slight that no one marked them as questions at all. A casual remark about how swiftly bruises could form, an absent-minded musing on whether Amelia had been a generous lender, a half-heard thought about how roses required tending at odd hours. These drifted into the air like dandelion seeds, to settle where they would, at the general store, where she paused to buy a reel of pale pink wool. She overheard Mr. Jessup, the nurseryman, defending himself to Mrs. Bartlett. "I've supplied soil and feed to every garden in St. Mary Mead, and never a complaint to stand on. Mrs. Harcourt, she was particular, aye, but no more than any lady with pride in her blooms. Quarrel, not I. Business is business." Yet Miss Marple noticed the way his hands worried at his cap, twisting and smoothing, twisting and smoothing. That kind of nervousness belonged not to anger, but to fear. Fear perhaps of being accused, or fear of some other entanglement. The official police presence had by midday imposed its own kind of order. Inspector Cray had sealed off the Rose Walk, placed a young constable on watch, and begun formal interviews at the vicarage study. He moved with efficiency, yet Miss Marple sensed in him the frustration of a man used to clear cases of theft and assault, now mired in the subtleties of genteel society. He treated motives as he would a ledger, marking them down in columns: Colonel Blount's rivalry, Mrs. Fanshaw's peculiar closeness, Mr. Jessup's quarrel, Mrs. Harcourt's rumoured debts. Neat, balanced, and incomplete. When Miss Marple passed by the gate later that day, she saw him pacing the gravel, notebook in hand. He paused to greet her, perhaps hoping the old lady might yield some overlooked witness detail. "You live near Mrs. Harcourt, I believe?" he asked politely. "Oh, no, not so very near. But one hears things in a village, Inspector. One notices the little comings and goings. It is quite impossible not to if one has eyes." Cray gave a rueful smile. "And what did your eyes notice yesterday, Miss Marple?" "Only that people behave much as they always do," she replied mildly. "Some are quick to show temper, others to hide distress. And people often say one thing while their hands say quite another." He looked puzzled, but she added no more, content to let him ponder. For Miss Marple knew that truth was not revealed by pressing harder, but by waiting, by letting human nature express itself in the little ways it always did. That evening, the gossip had taken firmer shape. Amelia Harcourt had not died of natural causes. Of that most villagers were convinced. Whether poison in her tea, a struggle by the roses, or some sudden hidden weakness, every theory had a champion. What remained was the tightening of suspicion, and in a place as close-knit as St. Mary Mead, suspicion travelled swiftly. Colonel Blount, once a figure of respect, was now eyed askance in the lane. Mrs. Fanshaw's tears were considered too theatrical, and her genteel protests now whispered of calculation. Even the vicar's wife, who prided herself on Christian charity, admitted in a lowered voice that Amelia had not been universally liked. Yet Miss Marple, seated by her window as the evening settled over the village, held her knitting motionless upon her lap. She was turning over not the village's speculations, but the image of a blue saucer, with one missing slice of lemon, of a gleaming cup pressed strangely into soil, of a bruise upon a wrist. Such things were small, so small that others dismissed them, but she knew that in their very smallness lay truth. People overlooked trifles because they sought grand explanations. She, however, knew trifles were the signposts by which human folly revealed its path. She had not yet spoken her thoughts aloud. For the moment, it was enough to listen, to let the threads of talk weave themselves into a pattern, and when the pattern became too tangled for others to follow, she would quietly, gently unpick the knots. For Amelia Harcourt had not simply collapsed among her roses. Someone's hand had guided her death, and in St. Mary Mead no secret remained buried for long. By the second day, Inspector Cray had begun to shape his case into what seemed, to him at least, a coherent whole. He was a man who valued order, and in the muddle of St. Mary Mead's chatter, the sharp outlines of Colonel Blount stood out. The rivalry with Mrs. Harcourt was well known. The very public defeat at the Rose Show was fresh in everyone's mind, and several villagers swore they had seen him follow her in the direction of the Rose Walk not long before her body was discovered. Motive, opportunity, and a hint of temper. What more could be asked? The inspector wasted little time in calling the colonel to the vicarage for a more formal questioning. The retired officer arrived punctually, his boots shining and his grey moustache bristling, as if attending a court-martial. He sat stiffly in the study chair, hands gripping the armrests with the controlled force of a man determined to master his nerves. "I am to understand," Cray began, "that you and Mrs. Harcourt were in rivalry for the Silver Rose Cup." "Rivalry?" The colonel's voice cracked like a parade ground order. "We competed, yes. Friendly competition. I take pride in my roses, sir. But rivalry? That implies pettiness, which I abhor. And yet you were observed, Colonel, to appear, shall we say, displeased at the announcement of Mrs. Harcourt's victory." Blount's eyes narrowed. "Displeased, yes, outraged. No, I have spent a lifetime accepting orders, Inspector. To lose a contest of blooms is hardly a dishonor. I congratulated her at once, though I will admit she bore herself with smugness." Cray pressed, his pencil poised over his notebook. "You were also seen following her toward the roses." "I was seeking a moment of quiet away from prying eyes," Blount retorted. "I suffer from gout, Inspector. A few steps among the borders afforded me respite. If anyone saw me, they are mistaken as to my purpose. Did you speak to Mrs. Harcourt at that time?" "No, nor did I see her. By the time I returned, the cry had gone up." Cray closed his notebook with a decisive snap, the sound carrying his private conclusion. Here was a man with motive and opportunity. The rest, he believed, would be proven by diligence. To Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the vicarage parlour under pretense of waiting to return some hymn books, the decision felt premature. She saw in the colonel a man irascible, yes, and deeply proud, but his indignation rang with the note of insulted honour rather than guilt. He was a man used to defending himself against accusations, real or imagined, and his words, though sharp, carried no tremor of concealment. Later that afternoon, gossip buzzed like bees about a disturbed hive. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley declared it was obvious the colonel had let his temper get the better of him. "I said from the beginning, didn't I? He never could abide a woman besting him. Military men are like that." Mrs. Bartlett nodded solemn agreement, though she privately thought Amelia's triumphal smirk would have driven any decent person to distraction. At the Green Man, Timothy Seaton, the chemist's assistant, whispered theories about poison. "If it were lemon in her tea, Inspector ought to test it. Arsenic has no taste, you know. And where might one procure such a thing if not from a chemist's?" His eager eyes darted to his employer's shop across the green, though whether with guilt or the thrill of scandal, no one could quite say. In drawing-rooms and at back gates, every recollection was sifted anew. Several claimed to remember the colonel's dark look as Amelia raised the cup. One insisted he had muttered under his breath. Others recalled hearing the metallic clang that Mr. Cotterill had spoken of. Bit by bit, the story thickened into certainty. By evening, half the village had concluded that Colonel Blount must be guilty, and the other half, while not so bold, considered it very likely indeed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent her morning quietly visiting Ivy, the maid who remained shaken. Seated in the vicarage kitchen with a cup of weak tea, Ivy repeated her account of the missing lemon slices, her voice tremulous but steady. "I know there was one left, ma'am. I counted them myself, for Mrs. Hemming said to be careful. And then when I cleared away, gone." "All gone?" Miss Marple patted her hand. "You did quite right to notice, my dear. One must always pay attention to the little things. The missing lemon, you see, may tell us something very important." To Ivy this seemed mysterious, but she was comforted by the old lady's calm assurance. Miss Marple left soon after, her mind turning not to the colonel but to the tea, the saucer, and the oddly deliberate way the silver rose cup had been found pressed into the soil. Inspector Cray, however, pressed on with his course. That afternoon he returned to Colonel Blount with an air of gathering triumph. "You had every reason to resent Mrs. Harcourt, Colonel. Witnesses place you near the scene. You must know how it looks." Blount's face flushed red. "I will not be insulted, sir. My honor is spotless. If you think otherwise, produce your evidence." Cray admitted that evidence beyond suspicion was thin. The doctor could not declare cause of death without further examination, though he allowed that poison was a possibility. But the inspector had set his sights, and it would take more than absence of proof to sway him. Word spread swiftly that the colonel was all but under arrest. His servants bristled at the indignity, his gardener muttered darkly about injustice, and even those who disliked him shook their heads at the idea of a man of his standing brought so low. Through it all, Miss Marple remained serenely unshaken. She did not proclaim his innocence. She seldom proclaimed anything, but her sharp blue eyes continued to study the edges of the story others ignored. She thought of Mrs. Fanshawe, who cried too prettily, and of Mr. Jessup, who twisted his cap with guilty fingers. She thought of Timothy Seaton's fascination with poison, and of Mrs. Harcourt's supposed debts. Above all, she thought of the lemon slice, a detail too slight for others but one that tugged insistently at her mind. Human nature, she knew, revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in trifles, and human nature in St. Mary Mead had not yet told its whole story. The colonel might be an easy suspect, but ease and truth rarely walked hand in hand. Somewhere in the village, another hand had guided Amelia Harcourt to her death, and Miss Marple meant to find it. The village seemed content to let suspicion rest upon Colonel Blount, but Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, did not share their certainty. She had learned long ago that the obvious suspect was rarely the true one. When human passions were at work, appearances could be as misleading as a tidy parlor hiding dust beneath its rugs. It was with this thought that she turned her mind once more to the smaller details, the ones everyone else had overlooked. Inspector Cray had sent word to Melchester for further analysis of Mrs. Harcourt's teacup and saucer. Timothy Seaton, eager as a schoolboy, had already whispered about arsenic, but Cray had been cautious. Poison might indeed explain the sudden collapse, and the curious bruising on her wrist could be a product of the fall, but there was no certainty yet. Still, as the inspector busied himself with his neat columns of suspects and motives, Miss Marple thought not of poison in the abstract, but of the little blue saucer and the vanished slice of lemon. She had not forgotten Ivy's account, and so the next morning she went to the vicarage on the pretext of calling upon Mrs. Hemmings. In the kitchen, with its warm smell of baking and faint aroma of polish, she gently asked to see the tray from the day of the rose show. Ivy obligingly produced it, a jumble of cups, saucers, and spoons, stacked with the haste of shock. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the small blue saucer, chipped at one edge. She ran her finger lightly round its rim, noting the faint stickiness that lingered even after washing. "Lemon leaves such a curious trace," she murmured. "One might almost miss it," Ivy blinked. "Oh, I scrubbed them all, ma'am. Twice over. No doubt, child, no doubt. It is only that lemon lingers. Rather like human misdeeds, you know." She smiled kindly and asked no more. Yet as she left, she carried with her the image of that faint tackiness. In her mind, she saw a hand slipping a slice of lemon into a cup not meant for it, saw Amelia Harcourt lift it without suspicion, and saw how very easy it would be to conceal something within the thin wedge of fruit. The thought sat with her as she walked through the village. At the post office, she overheard Mrs. Price Ridley confidently asserting that the colonel had near shouted at Amelia the week before about her roses shading his. At the Green Man, Timothy was telling an attentive audience that arsenic dissolved perfectly in tea, though one must take care with the dosage. At every corner the same refrain, the colonel's temper, the colonel's opportunity. Yet none of them spoke of the tea, of the lemon, or of the strangely deliberate way the trophy had been found pressed into soil. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bartlett, ostensibly to ask after her rheumatism. Mrs. Bartlett, delighted to have company, launched into her own recollections of the Rose Show. She remembered Amelia's pride, Mrs. Fanshaw's admiration, and the way Mr. Cotterill had fussed with his camera. But when Miss Marple asked, with an air of idle curiosity, who had poured the tea for Amelia, Mrs. Bartlett paused. "Why, I think she helped herself," she said slowly. Mrs. Hemings was occupied with the plates. Ivy carried the tray, but I distinctly recall Amelia taking the cup herself. She said she wanted lemon. She always did. I remember because I thought it was rather fussy, with so many of us waiting. Miss Marple nodded, knitting needles clicking gently in her lap. Yes, quite. People's little preferences do stand out, don't they? And was anyone near enough to pass her the lemon? Mrs. Bartlett frowned, searching her memory. Why, Mrs. Fanshawe, I believe. She was fluttering about, all admiration. She might have handed her the slice. It was only a small remark, easily lost among the chatter, but to Miss Marple it was a thread worth tugging. Mrs. Fanshaw's delicate tears, her overdone expressions of grief, her insistence on being Amelia's closest friend, these had always struck Miss Marple as just slightly over-practiced. And now here was the suggestion that Mrs. Fanshawe might have been the one to handle the lemon. Later, as Miss Marple sat in her garden among her own modest roses, she allowed herself to reflect. If poison had been introduced, the lemon slice would have been a most convenient vehicle. And if Mrs. Fanshawe had indeed offered it, then her protestations of friendship took on a rather different colour. Yet motive was still cloudy. What could drive a woman of such gentility to so dreadful an act? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in roses or rivalry, but in money. Amelia's supposed debts had been whispered about. Perhaps there was more to them than idle gossip. People in small villages rarely killed for glory, but they did for money, for shame, or to keep a secret buried. Miss Marple recalled, with her remarkable store of observation, that Mrs. Fanshawe had once, at a whist evening, let slip that she was so relieved to have managed a little legacy wisely. She had corrected herself quickly, but Miss Marple had noted the sharpness of her tone. A woman who worried about money often worried desperately. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray pursued his case against the Colonel with increasing certainty. He had discovered that Blount's army pension, though comfortable, did not stretch to extravagance, and that he had once spoken harshly to Amelia about her vulgar display of foreign roses. To Cray this fitted neatly, pride wounded, temper aroused, honour lost. He intended, he said, to press for charges as soon as the laboratory confirmed any trace of poison. Miss Marple, when asked her opinion by Mrs. Hemings over tea, only smiled. Oh, the Colonel is a proud man, certainly, but pride alone does not drive one to such lengths. There are many little motives in a village, my dear. One must look carefully at all of them. Mrs. Hemings sighed. You always make it sound so complicated, Miss Marple. To me it seems so simple. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, but life is seldom simple. Even roses have their thorns hidden beneath the petals. That evening, as the church bell tolled across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her lamp and laid down her knitting. She thought again of the blue saucer, of the missing lemon slice, of Mrs. Fanshaw's fluttering kindness, and the way she had spoken of the etching on the cup. People revealed themselves in the things they chose to notice. To admire an etching was nothing in itself, but coupled with a chance to handle the trophy and the lemon, it suggested opportunity of a subtler kind. The inspector might be satisfied with Colonel Blount, but Miss Marple was not. She had glimpsed beneath the layers of gossip and grief a detail too telling to ignore. The missing lemon was not merely a trifle. It was the beginning of truth. And in St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of surfacing. However carefully it was buried beneath roses and polite conversation. Inspector Cray's case against Colonel Blount was progressing with the determination of a man who disliked loose ends, But St. Mary Mead itself was far less tidy. Beneath the surface calm of clipped hedges and orderly gardens, conversations grew edgier, voices lowered when neighbours passed by, and more than one household felt the uncomfortable press of secrets half buried. Miss Marple, moving serenely from drawing room to shop, gathered the strands as only she could, her eyes missing nothing, her manner as mild and unthreatening as a teapot on a tray. Mrs. Fanshawe remained conspicuous in her grief, though its display became increasingly elaborate. She insisted to all who would listen that Amelia Harcourt had been her dearest confidant, that she alone had understood Amelia's true gentle nature. Yet in the same breath she allowed hints of Amelia's sharp tongue, her tendency to press one beyond what was kind. Miss Marple listened, nodding with sympathy, and observed that Mrs. Fanshawe's delicate handkerchief was quite dry, though she dabbed at her eyes frequently. It struck her, too, how quickly Mrs. Fanshawe steered conversations away from money whenever Amelia's rumoured debts arose. Meanwhile, Mr. Jessup, the nurseryman, pressed by gossip about his supposed quarrel with Amelia, became increasingly defensive. Miss Marple encountered him outside the general store, his boots dusted with soil, his cap tugged low. He insisted he had delivered the peat on time, though Amelia had claimed otherwise, and swore that she had threatened to take her custom elsewhere. What struck Miss Marple was not his denial, but his nervousness. He twisted his cap round and round, the gesture of a man frightened less by suspicion than by exposure of some other matter. She made a kindly remark about how hard it must be to manage orders, with so many gardens demanding attention, and he blurted, "I'm behind on payments myself. That's the truth, but I never laid a hand on her." It was more than she had asked for, but not more than she had expected. Colonel Blount, though under the inspector's shadow, maintained a rigid dignity. He walked the lane each morning at precisely 9, nodded curtly to those who dared greet him, and returned to his house without lingering. Yet Miss Marple noted the gardener at his property, shaking his head when he thought himself unobserved, and later she heard from Mrs. Bartlett that the colonel had quarrelled with his nephew over an inheritance dispute. Though the matter was whispered rather than shouted, it was clear that money and family pride were never far from his temper. But it was Timothy Seaton, the chemist's assistant, who provided the most curious spectacle. He had begun to insinuate himself into every conversation, offering unsolicited explanations of poisons, dosages, and symptoms with the eagerness of a schoolboy who longs to impress. Miss Marple overheard him telling Mrs. Price Ridley that arsenic dissolves clean, but one must be clever with timing, else the taste lingers. Mrs. Price Ridley, both scandalized and thrilled, repeated his words to half the village by evening. It was clear Timothy enjoyed his role as amateur expert, but Miss Marple wondered whether his fascination was wholly innocent. Sometimes people who spoke too much of crime were either hiding guilt or craving attention to divert it. The turning point came when Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Hemmings, who was still shaken by the discovery in her garden. Over tea, Miss Marple remarked almost idly. It was such a pity that Mrs. Harcourt should have left us so suddenly. One wonders if she had enemies, though she seemed a lady of distinction. Mrs. Hemmings sighed. She had admirers, certainly, but I'm not sure about friends. She could be generous one day and withering the next. And there was that cousin, Gerald, I think his name was, who wrote to her constantly. I once overheard her complain that he was a dreadful nuisance, always pressing her for funds. Gerald, Miss Marple repeated gently, as if trying the name on her tongue. Family can be a burden. Did she ever speak of helping him? Helping him? Mrs. Hemmings gave a wry smile. More like being drained by him. She told me once she had refused him, but her expression was queer, almost frightened. I didn't press her, of course. It was another thread to weave into the tapestry. A cousin in need of money, a lady with debts of her own, and a suspiciously generous Mrs. Fanshawe, fluttering about at every mention of inheritance or finance. It seemed increasingly clear that Amelia's death was not born solely of roses and rivalry, but of more practical concerns. When Miss Marple returned home that evening, she found Inspector Cray waiting outside her cottage. He was polite but firm. "You have a way of hearing what people say, Miss Marple. I would be grateful for your impressions." She invited him in, set out a modest tray, and listened as he detailed his case, the Colonel's opportunity, the witnesses who placed him near the roses, his long-standing animosity toward Amelia, all neatly arranged. When he had finished, Miss Marple folded her hands. "It is a very sound case, Inspector," she said kindly. "And yet, does it not trouble you that so many are eager to speak against the Colonel? It is often the way that when suspicion points one way, tongues loosen very quickly. Human nature, you see. We are glad to lay blame on those we already distrust." Cray frowned. "You think I am mistaken?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that people seldom kill over a trophy, however much pride it carries. They kill for money, for fear, for love, or to hide something they cannot bear revealed. Look not at the roses, Inspector, but at the lemon. That, I believe, is where the answer lies." He looked baffled, but she offered nothing more. She had no intention of revealing her suspicions until they ripened. Instead, she turned the conversation to the odd eagerness of Timothy Seaton, the chemist's assistant, and to Mrs. Fanshaw's curious way of weeping without tears. The inspector made notes, though it was plain he still clung to the Colonel. The key. Days that followed drew out more secrets. Mrs. Bartlett confided that she had once overheard Amelia warning Mrs. Fanshaw never to speak of a certain arrangement. Mr. Jessup admitted privately that Amelia had pressed him for deliveries he could not afford, hinting she might expose his debts if he refused. And a letter arrived for Inspector Cray, forwarded from Amelia's solicitor, revealing that she had changed her will only a fortnight before, leaving a considerable sum not to her cousin Gerald, but quite unexpectedly to Mrs. Fanshaw. Miss Marple, hearing of the will through the vicar's wife, allowed herself a small sigh. It was never roses alone. It was money, always money, dressed in the fragrance of flowers and the courtesy of social calls. Now the pattern was forming. The Colonel was too obvious, Jessup too anxious, Timothy too foolish. But Mrs. Fanshaw, with her delicate grief and sudden inheritance, her hand lingering on the lemon slices, and her insistence on admiring the etching of the trophy. There lay something worth watching. That evening, as twilight softened the edges of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat with her knitting on her lap, though the needles did not move. She thought of Amelia Harcourt's life, of roses blooming unnaturally bright, of debts whispered and denied, of friends who wept too prettily, and of how people's hands always told more than their words. A hand that pressed a trophy into soil, a hand that passed a slice of lemon, a hand that twisted a cap out of nervousness. Each hand revealed its owner's truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, ruthless clarity, knew that soon the right hand would betray itself. The village, for all its gossip and chatter, could not conceal its thorns forever. The revelation of Amelia Harcourt's altered will spread through St. Mary Mead with the quiet ferocity of wildfire. By the following morning, every household knew that Mrs. Fanshaw, delicate and fluttering, stood to inherit a considerable sum. The whispers carried a sharper edge now, suspicion attaching itself to her name with the same inevitability that roses attracted greenfly. Mrs. Fanshaw herself responded with renewed tears, speaking tremulously of her shock at Amelia's generosity and insisting she had no idea of the change. Yet beneath her carefully arranged grief, Miss Marple detected a flicker of something less innocent, a tightness about the mouth, a guarded watchfulness in the eyes. Inspector Cray, though still reluctant to abandon his theory of Colonel Blount's guilt, was obliged to admit that the will complicated matters. "It provides motive," he said grimly, as if the word itself were distasteful. "But motive alone isn't proof. And Mrs. Fanshaw is such a gentle lady. I can hardly picture her slipping poison into a cup." Miss Marple, who could picture it very well indeed, only smiled politely. "Gentleness, Inspector, is sometimes a cloak more useful than armor. One must always look at what lies beneath." The inspector frowned but said no more. He had scarcely left the vicarage when fresh news arrived to shake the village further. Timothy Seaton, the chemist's assistant, had been found unconscious in the back room of the shop. His employer, Mr. Denning, discovered him sprawled across the work table, an overturned vial beside him, its contents staining the wood with a dark, unpleasant smear. At first it was thought he had taken a dangerous dose of some compound accidentally, but when Dr. Parry examined him, he raised his brows and muttered that it looked suspiciously like an attempt at self-poisoning, or at least the appearance of one. The village buzzed anew. Some said Timothy had tried to end his life out of guilt, unable to bear the knowledge of Amelia's death. Others suggested he had been preparing a demonstration to prove his theories of poison, and had foolishly overreached himself. But there were a few who whispered that perhaps someone wished to silence him, lest he reveal too much. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the chemist's shop that afternoon, studied the scene with calm eyes. Timothy, pale but recovering, protested weakly that he had only been experimenting to see how long a compound would take effect. His story wavered with inconsistencies, but what struck Miss Marple was the expression of Mr. Denning, the chemist himself. His face bore more than worry. It showed the irritation of a man whose livelihood had been compromised by foolishness. Yet there was something else too. A wary glance, a fear that trouble might reach further than his apprentice's antics. It was another thread in the tangled skein. If Timothy had truly attempted to poison himself, the question remained why. If someone else had attempted to poison him, then the matter was darker still, suggesting that Amelia's death was not an isolated act. Miss Marple, recalling the faint, sticky trace on the blue saucer, began to wonder whether someone feared that Timothy's loose tongue and chemical enthusiasm might stumble too close to the truth. That evening, as dusk fell and the church bell tolled its steady rhythm, Miss Marple reflected on how human misdeeds often bred further misdeeds. One act rarely stood alone. It required concealment, and concealment led to desperation. The attempt on Timothy's life, or his foolish mimicry of it, had unsettled the balance. If Amelia's death had been thought of as a single dreadful stroke, now it appeared part of a chain. And in such chains the weakest link always revealed the truth. The village, meanwhile, took sides with renewed vigor. Some insisted the colonel was guilty of both Amelia's murder and the attack on Timothy, eager to weave every incident into a single narrative. Others leaned heavily toward Mrs. Fanshawe, pointing to her inheritance and her proximity to the tea table. A few even suggested that Timothy himself was at the heart of it, dabbling in poisons beyond his comprehension and ensnaring others in his recklessness. Each theory was repeated, embroidered, and passed along until the truth was nearly lost in the noise. Miss Marple, however, kept her focus. She visited Timothy the next morning, finding him pale in bed, his eyes darting nervously. She spoke to him kindly, as one might to a wayward schoolboy. "It must have been very frightening, my dear, to find oneself at the mercy of one's own medicines. Still, accidents do happen." Timothy flushed. "It wasn't... Well, I didn't mean it wasn't what it seemed." "No, things rarely are," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But you must be careful. When people know a young man is fond of talking about poisons, they are very quick to assume the worst. And when someone dies, tongues wag even faster." He swallowed hard, his fingers twisting at the bedsheet. She saw guilt there, but not the guilt of murder. Rather, it was the guilt of a boy who had played too close to danger and feared being caught. Yet fear made people careless, and carelessness could expose truths better hidden. As she walked back through the lane, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. Another act of violence, or the suggestion of it, meant the killer was becoming desperate. Desperation, she knew, was the surest betrayer. Sooner or later, In the small, watchful world of St. Mary Mead, desperation would show itself in some small, telling act, a slip of the tongue, a gesture too sharp, a kindness too insistent. For now the village lay in uneasy quiet, its calm surface stretched thin over the swirling currents beneath. Inspector Cray pressed on with his official inquiries. The villagers whispered their theories behind closed doors, and Miss Marple, with her knitting folded neatly on her lap, kept her eyes upon the little things that others dismissed. She knew that another hand, beyond Colonel Blount's bluster and Timothy's foolishness, was guiding these events. And she knew that hand would not remain hidden much longer. The unease that had settled over St. Mary Mead deepened after Timothy's collapse. People kept their doors a little more firmly closed, their eyes a little sharper upon their neighbours. It was no longer just a question of Amelia Harcourt's death. The suggestion that someone else had nearly been poisoned made the air itself feel suspect. Inspector Cray tried to keep control, summoning villagers for fresh statements, but the harder he pressed, the less willing they seemed to speak plainly. Gossip continued to swirl, yet it was curiously evasive, everyone hinting at something but naming nothing directly. In such an atmosphere, Miss Marple knew the time was ripe for a small, deliberate test. Her mind kept circling back to Mrs. Fanshawe. So many little things tugged her that way. The inheritance revealed in the new will, the insistence on her close friendship with Amelia, the fluttering grief so perfectly staged, the likelihood that she had been the one to pass Amelia the lemon slice. And now, with Timothy silenced, whether by his own foolishness or another's hand, Miss Marple sensed the killer's hand tightening. Desperation, she always said, made people clumsy. But to catch them, one had to give them the chance to betray themselves. She chose her moment at a small gathering in the vicarage drawing-room, arranged under the guise of providing comfort to the shaken village. Mrs. Hemmings had suggested tea and sponge cake for a few of the ladies, and Inspector Cray, though initially reluctant, agreed that it might be useful to have several people together in one room. Colonel Blount was invited too, as if to show that the police had not yet fixed guilt entirely upon him. Mrs. Fanshawe arrived in a pale grey dress, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her handkerchief folded neatly in her hand. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting in her lap, while the conversation turned inevitably to Amelia. She was so very particular, Mrs. Bartlett sighed. Always insisting on lemon, never milk. Quite a fuss, really, when one thinks of it. Ah, yes, Miss Marple said softly, as if to herself. So particular, and so trusting. She never once suspected that something could be hidden in that very lemon she preferred. The room fell still for the briefest instant. Colonel Blount stiffened, his moustache bristling, but his eyes showed only impatience. Mrs. Bartlett gave a startled cluck. Mrs. Fanshawe, however, let out a small gasp before covering it with a nervous laugh. My dear Miss Marple, you do paint such dreadful pictures. To suggest anyone would tamper with a slice of lemon, it's too fanciful. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. Fanciful, yes. And yet it would be such a simple thing. Easier, perhaps, than slipping anything into sugar or milk. A lemon wedge soaked beforehand, placed quite innocently upon a saucer. Why, the lady herself might even ask for it. She glanced up mildly. Of course, it would require someone attentive enough to anticipate her request, and close enough to provide it, without attracting notice. Mrs. Fanshawe's smile wavered. Surely, Miss Marple, you cannot mean— I mean nothing at all, Miss Marple said sweetly. I am but an old woman with too much imagination. One learns, you see, from the little things. I recall once in our village, many years ago, a cat died most suddenly after being given a saucer of milk. Everyone thought it natural, until one noticed the neighbour who was so very eager to pour the milk herself. That eagerness was her undoing. The words hung in the room, gentle yet piercing. Colonel Blount coughed into his fist. Mrs. Bartlett's eyes grew wide, and Mrs. Fanshawe's hands clutched her handkerchief until the lace tore. For just a moment her composure cracked, and in that crack Miss Marple glimpsed the fear beneath. Then Mrs. Fanshawe rallied, speaking hurriedly of how cruel it was to dwell on such morbid possibilities. Inspector Cray, who had been watching intently, shifted in his chair. He had not missed the change in Mrs. Fanshawe's expression, nor the tremor in her voice. Yet he said nothing, only noted it silently as Miss Marple intended. The gathering broke up soon after, everyone unsettled. Miss Marple remained behind a moment to speak with the vicar's wife, her voice pitched low. "It is always revealing, my dear, to speak of things as though they are only stories. Those who are innocent hear a tale. Those who are guilty hear an accusation." That evening, as Miss Marple walked home under the dimming sky, she reflected on the progress of her little test. She had seen what she needed. Mrs. Fanshawe's mask had slipped, if only for a heartbeat. But a heartbeat was enough. Now she must be patient, for those who felt watched often betrayed themselves further in the effort to seem unconcerned. She did not have to wait long. The very next day Mrs. Fanshawe called at her cottage, all fluttering kindness, to ask if Miss Marple required anything from the shops. Her voice was overly bright, her manner too eager, as though she sought to assure herself of Miss Marple's goodwill. The old lady received her with gentle courtesy, but her eyes missed nothing. When Mrs. Fanshawe glanced about the room, her gaze lingered a moment too long on the teacups set neatly on the sideboard, her lips tightening ever so slightly before she smiled again. After she had gone, Miss Marple sat very still. It was clear now. The inheritance, the lemon, the brittle composure, each piece fit together. But to prove it, she would need more than a slip of expression. She would need to draw the truth into the open, where no denial could obscure it. She thought again of the silver rose cup, lying pressed into soil beside Amelia's body. That gesture had not been one of rage, but of concealment, an attempt to smother evidence in the earth itself. Whoever had done it was not thinking of trophies at all, but of something much more practical, hiding a telltale stain, perhaps, or removing a trace before others could see. Such a detail, so small, pointed as surely as a compass needle. The village might still chatter of Colonel Blount and his temper, or of Timothy and his foolish experiments, but Miss Marple knew the real danger lay elsewhere. She had nudged the mask once and seen the crack appear. Now she must find a way to let it break entirely, in the presence of those who mattered most. For truth, once revealed, could not be hidden again, not in St. Mary Mead, and not in the quiet heart of a woman who had thought her gentleness the perfect disguise. Inspector Cray had grown restless. His neat columns of motives and opportunities no longer seemed to align. The laboratory had confirmed what Miss Marple had already intuited. Amelia Harcourt's death had been caused by arsenic, introduced not into sugar or milk, but into the lemon slice she had placed in her tea. The inspector had blanched when he read the report, for Miss Marple's gentle suggestion about the lemon had been exact. He no longer dared dismiss her observations, though he did not yet know how to shape them into action. It was Miss Marple herself who proposed a small gathering, just as she had known she would. People feel freer, Inspector, in company than in solitude. Secrets are harder to keep when one hears how others interpret events. It is like knitting. One drop stitch may escape notice, but when the whole pattern is laid out, the gap becomes obvious. So it was that the villagers most entangled in the affair found themselves seated in the vicarage drawing-room once more. Colonel Blount sat stiffly, his military posture unbent, though indignation still simmered beneath his moustache. Mr. Jessup, cap in hand, shifted nervously, while Timothy Seaton, pale from his recent collapse, hovered with the unease of one who had been too often accused by gossip, and Mrs. Fanshawe, delicate in lavender silk, composed her features into a mask of gentle sorrow, her handkerchief at the ready. Miss Marple, knitting needles poised, spoke as if telling a story to children. It is curious, is it not, how very simple things can undo us? A slice of lemon, for instance. So bright, so harmless, yet it may conceal what sugar or milk would not. Mrs. Harcourt was particular, always lemon, never milk. And on that afternoon someone anticipated her request. Someone placed a slice already prepared, and she, trusting, took it without question. Mrs. Bartlett, who had been invited as witness to earlier remarks, nodded vigorously. Yes, I saw her take it herself. Mrs. Fanshawe was right by her, as I recall. At this, Mrs. Fanshaw's handkerchief fluttered. I may have passed her the saucer. So natural, so thoughtless, but what of it? To suggest I had anything to do with her death is monstrous. Her voice quavered with just the right note of affronted gentility, but her eyes flickered, quick and sharp, toward Inspector Cray. Miss Marple continued as if she had not heard. The silver rose cup, too, was found pressed into the soil. A curious thing. If one were to drop it in shock, it would fall upon the grass. But pressed into the earth, that suggests a hand guiding it. Perhaps to smear away some trace of powder, some faint glimmer that might betray what had been done. Colonel Blount gave a grunt of satisfaction. There, I told you. No soldier would be so careless. My honor, though I doubt anyone will apologize, but Miss Marple only smiled. And then there is Timothy, poor boy, always speaking of poisons, eager to show his knowledge. He was no more than a diversion. Someone thought him useful to suspicion, and when he babbled too freely, he was nearly silenced with another dose. Not to kill, perhaps, but to frighten, to cast blame more firmly. Timothy flushed, his voice breaking. I didn't mean... He faltered, then looked around wildly, relieved to see the old lady's kindly gaze upon him. For it was plain she did not consider him guilty. And Mrs. Harcourt's will, Miss Marple went on, her voice still mild as though recounting village history, changed only weeks before her death, leaving a handsome sum to one who insisted she was a friend. Yet it was no friendship Amelia felt, but fear. She hinted of it to Mrs. Hemings, that she was importuned, that she dreaded exposure. Yes, Amelia was in debt, but she feared another more. A person who could not bear to lose the security she craved, who fluttered prettily, but clutched fiercely when the mask slipped. Mrs. Fanshawe rose suddenly, her face pale. This is intolerable. I will not sit here while innuendo soils my good name. Inspector, I demand. Miss Marple's eyes lifted, calm as ever. My dear, no one else had both motive and opportunity. You alone stood close enough to offer the lemon. You alone gained from the will. You alone wept without tears. And you alone betrayed yourself when the lemon was mentioned, for innocence hears a story, but guilt hears accusation. Amelia meant to cut you off, I believe. She feared you would drain her dry, and so she altered her will, thinking to control you. But you were too desperate. Money, always money, it is so much more deadly than roses. For a moment the room held its breath. Mrs. Fanshawe's composure fractured, her lips trembling, her eyes darting from face to face. Then she let out a strangled sob, pressing the handkerchief hard against her mouth, but this time it could not conceal the truth. Inspector Cray rose, his expression grim, and laid a hand upon her shoulder. She sagged under the touch, her body collapsing into the chair as if all strength had drained away. It was not meant, she whispered hoarsely. Only a little, just enough to make her ill. She would have reconsidered. She would have given me what was fair. But she took it all, she swallowed it all, and then... Her voice broke, and silence fell heavy in the room. Miss Marple set down her knitting. It is always the same, Inspector. People believe they can manage their misdeeds, that they can dose out just enough of harm to bend life to their will. But harm grows beyond their control. It is as true of poison as it is of lies. Cray nodded, his jaw set. He gave orders quietly, and Mrs. Fanshawe was escorted from the room, her fluttering handkerchief hanging limp in her hand. Colonel Blount drew himself up, pride wounded yet vindicated, while Timothy wept openly in relief. The villagers, murmuring, dispersed, leaving the vicarage once more to its stillness. Miss Marple, ever composed, gathered her knitting into her bag. She spoke only to the vicar's wife, who stood pale and shaken. It is not roses that are dangerous, my dear, but human hearts. They grow thorns far sharper than any stem. And with that, she stepped out into the cool evening, the village once more safe on the surface, though forever altered beneath. The days following Mrs. Fanshaw's arrest unfolded with the curious mixture of relief and discomfort that always followed the exposure of a crime in St. Mary Mead. Outwardly, the village resumed its rhythms. Shops opened at the usual hour, the church bell tolled as it always did, and gardens received their daily tending. Yet beneath the familiar surface lay a tension, like the taut string of a violin, ready to tremble at the lightest touch. People spoke less freely in the lanes, their gossip tinged with unease. As though they had glimpsed a shadow in their own drawing rooms, Colonel Blount walked with his head held high, though his gait was stiffer than before. He accepted the murmured apologies of neighbours with brusque nods, not unkind but unwilling to dwell. Pride allowed him to forgive their suspicions, though not to forget. Mr. Jessup busied himself with his deliveries, glad that attention had shifted away from his financial troubles. Timothy Seaton, though spared the worst of suspicion, remained sheepish and subdued. His employer kept him firmly under watch, and the young man's eager chatter of poisons had fallen into a chastened silence. In the vicarage, Mrs. Hemmings fretted over the lingering notoriety of her garden. She confided to Miss Marple that she feared the roses would never look the same again. "It is dreadful," she said, twisting her hands. "I cannot see them without thinking of poor Amelia, lying there with that dreadful cup beside her. I wonder if I ought to cut them all down." Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, shook her head gently. "Oh, my dear, roses are not to blame. They are only flowers doing as nature intended. It is people who give them meanings they were never meant to bear. To cut them would be to punish beauty for the ugliness of a human deed." Mrs. Hemmings sighed, somewhat comforted, and set about preparing scones for the afternoon tea, as though the act of baking might restore her equilibrium. The village talk turned, inevitably, to Mrs. Fanshawe. Some spoke of her with pity, recalling her fragile manner and the lonely circumstances that had made her dependent upon Amelia. Others condemned her roundly, pointing to her fluttering airs and the too eager grief she had displayed. But all agreed on one thing. It was unsettling to realize that beneath her gentle smile had lurked such desperation, that in the quiet heart of their village a woman had planned so carefully and struck so ruthlessly. Inspector Cray, though gratified by the resolution, carried himself with a sober air. He had confided to Miss Marple that he felt the sting of nearly pressing the wrong charge. "I was so certain of Blount," he admitted. "Everything pointed to him. His temper, his rivalry, his presence near the roses. It seemed the only possible conclusion." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It is the commonest of errors, Inspector. We are all too ready to believe the obvious, because it fits so neatly. But human nature is rarely neat. People do the unexpected, and their motives are more tangled than any rosebush. You did well to keep an open mind when new facts came." He inclined his head, grateful for her generosity, though he knew she had seen what he had not. Her insight, quiet and understated, had turned the case from suspicion to truth. As for Miss Marple herself, she resumed her gentle routines, her days punctuated by tea, knitting, and the small errands of village life. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she reflected on the events with her usual clarity. She thought of Amelia Harcourt, proud of her roses yet burdened by debts, unaware of the danger that sat beside her at the tea-table. She thought of Mrs. Fanshawe, whose fragile airs had concealed a determination sharp enough to plot murder, driven by fear of poverty and the greed for security. And she thought of the others, Blount, Jessup, Timothy, each drawn into suspicion by their own flaws, though innocent of the crime itself. It was always the same, she mused. Crime was not born in dark alleys alone, but grew in drawing rooms, gardens and vicarage teas, wherever human weakness found fertile soil. The outward respectability of village life did not prevent sin. It merely disguised it more cleverly. To one who watched carefully, the signs were always there: a nervous hand, A too bright protestation, a tearless grief. On a quiet afternoon a week later, Miss Marple sat in her own garden, the air rich with the scent of her modest roses. She watched a bee hover among the blossoms and thought of the silver rose cup, tarnished now by its role in tragedy. The villagers would polish it again, of course, and in time it would gleam on some mantelpiece once more. But for her it would always carry the faint shadow of Amelia's fall and the desperate grasp of a woman undone by her own deceit. She folded her knitting neatly into her lap and allowed herself a small sigh. People would forget in time. They always did. Life would return to its routines, the gossip would settle back into trivialities, and the rose show would be held again next summer with new blooms and new rivalries. But beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, she knew the truth lingered, that human nature, in all its frailty and folly, was capable of as much cruelty as kindness, and so, while the village busied itself with forgetting, Miss Marple remembered. She did not brood, she never brooded, but she carried with her the quiet certainty that another test of character would come, another story would unfold in whispers and smiles, and another crime would one day disturb the roses. It was not cynicism, but simple observation, the product of a lifetime spent watching people reveal themselves in the smallest of ways. As evening fell, and the shadows lengthened across her little garden, Miss Marple rose, gathered her knitting, and went inside. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals soft, their thorns sharp. She paused to glance at them once more and murmured, half to herself, "It is not the roses we must fear, but the hands that pluck them," and with that she closed her door against the twilight, leaving the village to its peace, at least for now. The trial of Mrs. Fanshawe, when it came, was not much attended by the villagers of St. Mary Mead. They spoke of it often enough in their kitchens and over back gates, but the journey to Melchester was long, and most felt they already knew the story by heart. She was found guilty, of course. Her fragile airs and protestations of love for Amelia swept aside by the evidence of the poisoned lemon. The altered will and the quiet insistence of those who had witnessed her mask slip at last. When the verdict was read, the village heaved a collective sigh, part relief, part sorrow, and then, as villages always do, turned back to the rhythm of daily life. Colonel Blount regained some measure of dignity, though his pride bore the bruise of having been so freely suspected. He held his head higher than before, but there was a stiffness to his manner, as though he had grown more wary of the gossip that could so quickly condemn. Timothy Seaton remained at the chemist's, chastened but grateful, his reckless chatter sobered by the brush with death, and Mr. Jessup, relieved of suspicion at last, returned to his business with the determination to keep his accounts in better order, lest whispers again make him a target. The vicarage garden, where Amelia Harcourt had fallen, was once more a place of tea and polite conversation. The roses bloomed as they always had, heedless of the shadows cast by human folly. The silver rose cup, polished to a gleam, was placed again on display for the next year's show, though many remarked quietly that it seemed less bright than before. Perhaps, they said, some stains could never truly be polished away. Miss Marple, as ever, returned to her quiet routines. She was not triumphant. She never was. To her, the solving of a crime was not a matter of glory, but of duty, a necessary restoration of order. She took no pride in having seen what others missed, for she regarded it simply as observation. People revealed themselves always if one looked closely enough, and so she sat in her garden with her knitting, content to let the village heal in its own way. Yet in her mind, she carried the memory of Amelia Harcourt, proud, imperious, and undone by her own entanglements. She thought of Mrs. Fanshawe, whose gentleness had been a mask for greed, and of how swiftly desperation could turn to ruthlessness. She thought, too, of the villagers themselves, each so eager to suspect another, each so ready to believe the tale that best fitted their prejudices. It was not wickedness, not entirely. It was simply human nature with all its frailties. One afternoon the vicar's wife called on her, still troubled by it all. "I cannot reconcile it, Miss Marple," she said. "How could someone so delicate, so seemingly kind, harbour such cruelty? It feels impossible." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing mid-row. "My dear, it is not impossible at all. People wear masks every day. Smiles to hide envy, gentleness to hide greed, composure to hide fear. In time those masks slip, and sometimes when the stakes are high enough, they do more than slip. They crack altogether. Mrs. Fanshawe was no different. Her desperation made her act, and her mask could not withstand the weight of it." Mrs. Hemmings sighed. "It makes one almost afraid of one's neighbours." "Oh, not afraid," Miss Marple said gently. "Simply aware. People are very much the same everywhere, capable of kindness but also of folly. One mustn't despair of it. One must only watch and remember and be a little careful." The vicar's wife smiled, comforted by the old lady's calm certainty, and soon the conversation turned to parish matters. But Miss Marple's words lingered, as they always did. As summer ripened and the hum of bees filled the air once more, St. Mary Mead appeared unchanged to the casual eye. Yet for those who had lived through the death among the roses, there remained a faint shadow, a reminder that beneath the fragrance and bloom of village life lay human passions as tangled and thorny as any rosebush. And in her neat little cottage, with her spectacles perched upon her nose and her knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple reflected with her usual quiet wisdom. Crime, she knew, was never so far away as people liked to think. It was not the great cities alone that bred wickedness, but the small villages, where envy and greed could hide behind lace curtains and polite smiles. She had seen it too often to be surprised, yet she did not despair, for though human nature was frail, it was also endlessly fascinating, and she, with her sharp eyes and gentle manner, would always be there to untangle its knots. The roses in her own garden stirred in the breeze, their petals soft, their thorns sharp, and she thought, with a small knowing smile, how very much like people they were. And so life in St. Mary Mead moved forward, outwardly peaceful once again, while Miss Marple, ever patient and ever watchful, waited for the next story that human nature would inevitably write.